Let's have a quick look at some practical applications, shall we? I've read about Montreal and Detroit becoming hotbeds of urban agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about how these cities are already bringing Solarpunk ideas to life?
Montreal is a really good example of a place that, and also Detroit is another place that is becoming more and more well known for its urban agriculture, in part because of the shrinking of its economy and its kind of the post-apocalyptic nature of Detroit. At some points in the early 2010s, allowed for the cheap use of space in the suburbs to start urban agriculture happening. But this is all to say is that one of the things that I think people don't realize when we hear the word productivity applied to agriculture is that productivity is not how productive a square foot of land is or a square meter of land is. How much food can you grow? Has nothing to do with productivity. Instead, it's how much food you can grow per hour of labor. And urban agriculture is incredibly labor intensive, market gardening on a small scale.
Right.
What happens is that you can grow far more food in a small amount of space if you double the amount of people who are working on the land. And it doesn't necessarily double the cost of the food. It does increase it, but it doesn't double the cost of the food because you're growing so much more of it in a small amount of space. Montreal has basically been a ground zero for this. Again, it's spin permaculture, really intensive market gardening on small amounts of space using permaculture principles is basically how the urban agriculture scene has grown and is growing around the world. It's also rooftop market gardens growing lettuce and salad on warehouses and so on and so forth. I've never understood why my local supermarket, which has a flat roof, doesn't have A, solar panels, or B, why isn't all the lettuce being grown on the roof, because then they could just cut it and take it downstairs and sell it.
But they do it. But they do it in extreme winter conditions at that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've been to Montreal in the depth of winter, and it was like minus 30 one year. I remember I couldn't even walk 100 meters before turning back into the warmth of my apartment. That's amazing that they do it all there.
The invention of what's known as the caterpillar tunnel, which is very important in regenerative agriculture, which is a certain kind of polytunnel like greenhouse with steel frames and polytarp over the top. I think it's one way. It's like a certain kind of polytarp that allows like UV in.
Traps heat.
Yeah. And the polytunnel is, I guess, 12 years old now. I mean, obviously, the idea of a plastic greenhouse goes all the way back to the 1950s, but the particular design of what is now known as a polytunnel is actually relatively recent and has enabled small-scale urban ag.
I want to ask you about developments outside the city.
Yep.
There was a project in Saudi Arabia, I forget its name, but it's an incredibly inspiring story of how you can reverse desertification, right? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's the Baydha project in Saudi Arabia, which is run by Neil Spackman, who was there for, I believe it was 10 years he was working on that project. And everyone should go watch the documentary, which I hope they'll put in the link below, just to show what is possible in terms of, and the principles that are outlined throughout Neil Spackman's work at Baydha are applicable to anywhere in an arid climate or mountainous climate. But where the project is a location where it rains like once every 2 years or something like that. They get very little rain, but when it does rain, they get flooding because the water rushes down the mountain and out into the wadi and straight out into the sea. And essentially, through the imposition of a keyline design strategy to hold the wall and to find the key points up in the mountains, which a key point is, I don't think I mentioned it earlier, a key point is basically the point in which erosion becomes deposition in a landscape.
Right. So
that's the natural place to put the highest point that you can put a pond, basically, safely, is that exact point where erosion becomes deposition. And essentially, through, I want to say, millions of man hours of work, building what's known as check dams, which are leaky rock dams up in the mountains, which both stop the speed of the water coming down the mountains, but also catch sediment to create new flat landscape in the cracks or the crags where the water rushes down,
Right.
and all sorts of impositions like this, check dams, gabions, which are very similar, but they're held together by mesh. And as you move further down the mountains, there's other larger ponds that they've constructed by basically creating small, like 2 or 3 rock dams, which pull the water in a flat environment. And then further down, as you actually get out into the wadi itself, they have large swales, which is basically a ditch that's dug on contour, which floods and fills up. And then on the upper side of the berm, which is the further away from the other side of the ditch, so the water goes into the ditch, is where you plant the trees, so it can use the water that's soaked into the ground. And essentially, through all of this spatial strategy that Neil Spackman implemented, he regreened this one valley, Al Baydha, and the results are astonishing to see. And it reminds me somewhat of, it's easier to talk about this kind of solarpunk work at the landscape level. I was in Portugal speaking at the Trienniale recently, and it's easier to talk about these ideas with people in Portugal or in the Mediterranean, where there are millions of man hours have been put in over the last thousands of years building terraces in the landscape. Or, over in Asia, there's the millions of man hours that have been spent building rice paddies. But this is what the environment or the landscape will look like in future. It's curated. Right, it's a curated environment, and I think Al Baydha is a really important project to see, to look at, and also there's regreening the desert in Jordan is another similar project, because if you can do it in Jordan, in the middle of nowhere in Jordan, then you can also do it, on a hillside just outside of Madrid or something. And then there's John D. Liu's documentary, which is Greening the Desert, which is China's vast ecological engineering to regreen the Loess Plateau, which is also worth checking out.